it would be good for those who are joining us for the first time and those who have actually seen the two previous talks. Thought it'd be good to just do a little recap because it has been a while, after all, since we began this journey together. And those of you who were in Chicago and had the opportunity to see the first two talks in person will remember that one took place on the 14th of January, on my birthday, then the second one in February. The third one, which is now being delivered, should have happened in March and then was delayed because of the coronavirus, and eventually is happening. So you can actually find the two other talks on YouTube. If you Google my name and Arte Povera, they'll come up. And since they've been up on YouTube, I've received a lot of interesting feedback from around the world, even professors in Italy saying they really enjoyed them and used them in their classes. So it was really, really nice and sweet to hear. So as you know, tonight we're talking about Arte Povera and what I've called ecologies, which is basically their concerns, interests, and commitment to the environment, but also to reconfiguring the idea of nature for what it is or for what it has been up until the late 60s for these artists. Nature is a big construct, right? It's what we associate with trees, fields, animals, but it's really in our heads much more than it is out there, especially if we believe that we are animals too, right? So why are we part of nature if nature is us? And I think what's fascinating about Arte Povera is that the journey of these artists really entailed rediscovering nature on an intimate scale, on a personal scale, on a scale that today actually feels so important because of what we're going through from an ecological perspective, but just right now, in the moment that we're in, with the lockdowns, with experiencing this restriction of our scopic field and ability to move, it's important to make the most of what's close to us, of what's within reach. And I think the Arte Povera artists really were ahead of their time without even knowing that what they did would actually be so topical today. Now, before I get to their conceptions of nature, I would like to just, as I said, summarize what we covered over the last two lectures very quickly. These are some of the names of the artists that are part of the Italian movement of Arte Povera. Some of these artists are still alive today and they're actually doing particularly well. We looked at the history of Arte Povera and how it began in 1967 and ended roughly in 1972, despite the fact that artists in this movement still continue to work with the ideas of Arte Povera today. And these are the cities in which Arte Povera articulated itself, from Torino to Roma, Genova, Bologna, Milano. It was cities in the north and central Italy that really took the subject of Arte Povera to heart. And some of the concepts that they explored in their work through the use of poor material entailed this beginning, the idea of starting from zero and reinvent what representation might actually be. And of course, the notion of space, language, and materiality. You will remember that we had a whole lecture, the second lecture was dedicated to materials. The Arte Povera artists were concerned with this dimension of a relational dimension. What is the space I inhabit? How can I define this space through language and reinvent it with the use of poor materials that transgress the history of classical art especially? So no marble, bronze, gold, and silver, but where can I find something that it's true and that it's somewhat disconnected from the capitalist logics that seem to define everyday life? That's where nature and the environments also come in. Don't forget that the Arte Povera artists lived at a time in which Italy was going through a very tangible ecological and urban series of changes. The North becoming more and more powerful as an industrial powerhouse, the South in opposition lagging behind economically, and becoming so much more connected to a rural reality that seemed obsolete to some, and nonetheless that preserved an integrity and an identity that it's still important to Italy today. And of course, how do you express this desire to find something that it's real, find something that you can cling to? The idea of everyday objects, the notion that everyday objects somehow can anchor us and perhaps provide us with a sense of identity, with a sense of clarity, which then relates to the body. Arte Povera artists were very interested in the relationship between the body, space, and objects, and architecture as well, because they think with a scale, they think through a scale that it's really human, that it's really individual. They try to avoid universalisms, generalizations, and they really think about this relationship between the body and the objects within the reach of the body itself. We also looked at the historical context in which Arte Povera unraveled and why it emerges at the end of the 60s. The Miracolo Italiano. Of course, we explore this moment of incredible prosperity, but also contradiction in the history of Italian culture. And you will remember as well that I mentioned to you that during the 50s and 60s, the lira was actually one of the strongest currencies in Europe, and it was actually very much valued by financial experts as an example, a good economic example. And of course, that led to a sense of freedom. And as you know, that sense of freedom can at times be fictitious. And in fact, the sense of independence that came with the with the financial fluidity and wealth also led to this sense of exploration, experimentation, a notion of freedom that really leads to revolutionary conceptions of what art can accomplish, that unfortunately, in the case of Italy, ends with disillusion. And it's here, at this very point, especially in 1968 and the early 70s, that we begin to see the change that Arte Povera documents so well with their art. And you will remember that I also mentioned Germano Celant and the importance of this art critic who launched Arte Povera, who theorized the work of Arte Povera. And unfortunately, I also have to mention that we lost Germano Celant only recently due to coronavirus at the age of 80. His career was incredible in Italy, an absolutely amazing art historian that is remembered for his very serious approach to art history and very dedicated approach to contemporary art. And we looked at the roots of Arte Povera as well. Remember, our first lecture asked the important question, what is art? And how artists that inspired Arte Povera contributed to the emergence and insistence of this question, a question that, surprise, surprise, we hadn't asked before. Marcel Duchamp and the ready-mades he created at this time are important to the overall question and how this question can be perpetrated through the work of other artists, like Yves Klein, for instance, that also we encountered in our lecture, who was a major influence on Arte Povera. Yves Klein also had a sense of humor that informs the movement of Arte Povera. And Alberto Burri, who very strongly influenced the interest for poor materials and materials that carry history with them, materials that have been bashed around by the world and then enter the gallery space in order to tell stories. You will remember his beautiful Creti, but also the sacks that he worked with. And of course, the unforgettable Piero Manzoni, I trust one of your favorite artists after my talk, if you had never encountered him before. Totally irreverent, probably the cheekiest artist in the history of art, who dared to tin his poo in order to challenge the art market, the capitalist undercurrents that define our appreciation of art, and just the question of, again, what is art and how do we attribute value to it? Now, something important about Arte Povera that I mentioned to you at the last past talks, is that Arte Povera generally stood in opposition to American pop art, to the interest for, generally speaking, mass-produced goods, as well as the commercialization of the cult of celebrities. So in a sense, what's fascinating is that Celant was actually very open about this opposition, and that situates Italian culture and Arte Povera in a very interesting place. So Arte Povera can be seen as this revolutionary movement of opposition, right, to the general trend that's defining the world. In the last talk on materiality and surfaces, we looked at the importance of classical materials and surfaces in the history of art. We also talked about Degas and how this ballerina upset the world of art, how it was inspired by African art. And we also noticed that there is a connection, a fil rouge that travels all the way from these irreverent gestures that took place at the end of the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th century, which artists in the 1960s feel extremely strongly about. This idea of challenging the status quo, challenging the notion of value, challenging even collectors and institutions with materials that are unusual, like Eternit in this case, materials that bring the notion of industrialization in the gallery space, or in this case here, in this work by Boetti, we use doilies to create these pillars that evoke the shape of classical columns. You can see him here at work. And we also looked at Jannis Kounellis, who will be important to the lecture today, and his revolutionary idea that straddles tradition, past histories, and the present through, again, physical encounters that are unusual. Then mirrors, by Giuseppe Penone, another key artist to today's lecture, who used or created these mirrored lenses, contact lenses, in order to create a vision that is interiorized and yet visible on the eyes of the artist himself. At the same time, we explored the mirrors that became the trademark of Michelangelo Pistoletto's work, and I'm showing you these because there'll be more Pistoletto in today's lecture. This idea that the artwork is never still, right? There's always something moving, and the artwork is always changing. Matrices, neon, Arte Povera explored materiality, and even jokes alla Manzoni, if you like. Remember this light bulb that goes off only for 11 seconds once a year. And olfactory works, so Jannis Kounellis working with coffee, for instance, because it introduces the notion of sort of distance and cultural association driven by something that's beyond the visible. And, you know, this is the true inspirational, the true research, the true experimentation of Arte Povera. Of course, Pistoletto and the beautiful Venus of the Rags. And then nature. Nature takes center stage in Arte Povera's artworks in a way that, you know, it's kind of been overlooked. You know, nature is always the underdog subject. That's why we're in this climate change situation. We decided a long time ago that we come first all the time. It's kind of anthropocentric, narcissistic disease we have. And we have failed to think of nature beyond the notion of resource. So with the idea of nature and what Arte Povera artists were experiencing at the end of the 1960s, remember the urbanization of the North and the rural persistence in the South, their concern is very real. They see environmental degradation in the environments around them, wherever they are in their cities. They see their cities of Milan, Turin, Bologna become more and more polluted. And they feel the idea, they really feel this notion that it is essential for us to reconnect with what we think is nature in a way that makes sense for us and nature itself. That's where the ecologies come from, this idea of connections between us and what else is non-human out there, whether it be landscapes, fields, plants, trees, connections between them, everything. And Arte Povera is really a pioneer movement when it comes to this. I really wish more attention was given to the incredible contribution of the Arte Povera movement on this subject. That's why I'm here tonight, right? Try and fix it and get it right. So remember, most art historians agree with the fact that Arte Povera deliberately stood in opposition to pop art, the glossy, the commercial, the capitalist, but they also didn't agree with this. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty, and I'm using it as an example of land art that was popular at the same time as Arte Povera was working on similar subjects. But we could also use Christo and Jean-Claude's Valley Curtain, which was an ecological disaster by all stretches of the imagination. And it's an interesting moment. During the 1960s, land art, this is basically what I am trying to capture here in a nutshell. Land art was a revolutionary movement too. Land art artists wanted to move out of the museum and escape the capitalist chain that prevents artists from exploring certain discourses and ideas. They wanted to move away from the notion of creating objects. They wanted to move away from the notion of the collector and the art market. So they looked for freedom outside the gallery space. However, when they went out, almost en masse, they started to make colossal statements, very anthropocentric statements. Their interest wasn't in understanding nature. Their interest wasn't in understanding and learning about the environment they were going to intervene upon. They would basically make a very anthropocentric statement about humanity in the landscape. And Arte Povera really works on a different wavelength. Again, as I said, scale-wise, thinking more about the individual human, but also in terms of being humble. There's nothing humble about this work by Christo and Jean-Claude, which really enraged those who lived in the valley, because he really didn't respect anything, never mind the landscape, but the wind, the birds that found this obstruction in their way, in their path. There's an intrusiveness, an arrogance to the land art of the 1960s that Arte Povera also rejects. So I wanted to just wrap up the ideas that define the notion of nature in Arte Povera. There's a sense of intimacy that it's really important. There's a sense of human scale, a sense of criticality. The question, what is nature, is essential to these artists. They don't give for granted that they know what it is, but they know they have been taught something is nature, and they're questioning that idea. And of course, there's an ecological awareness at the bottom of it all. These artists actually pose themselves questions about sustainability. Some of them are outright political when it comes to supporting the environment, and their work is really designed to make us appreciate and reconceive nature from the start. So let's begin our journey through Arte Povera and the artists who really push the ecological agenda with Marisa Merz. You will remember that I showed you this image already in the lecture that focused on materiality. And in this case, I wanted to really focus on the biomorphic quality of this sculpture. Now, biomorphism usually entails the notion that an object or a shape captures a characteristic that we associate with the living world. So there's usually this sense of movement, this sense of something that belongs to the animal or vegetal world. And in this case, you can see how Marisa Merz really accomplishes this really well by creating a sculpture that's movable. This beautiful jellyfish-like hanging proposition can be moved gently by the air in the gallery space. And when it's re-exhibited by a curator or somebody else in charge of exhibiting the piece, Marisa Merz is actually allowing a certain level of fluidity. She's not concerned with this configuration and allows curators to reinvent the piece to a certain degree so that it looks different every time. So you can see this becoming, right? The work of art is not still. The work of art suggests the livingness of animals or plants in a very open way, but it's also something that can be manipulated by us to create different solutions. This is possibly the biggest slap in the face to the history of classical art. Now imagine this, 1967, you are going to an exhibition at a gallery called L'Attico, right, which in Italian means the loft, well, in English means the loft, Attico, which is actually a disused garage. So it's actually underground, and it's filled with live horses. This is the work of Jannis Kounellis, who worked extensively with the Arte Povera movement and very much defined the movement along with Giuseppe Penone. They're probably the two most relevant and also most long-lived artists of the movement. So the question here is, why bring 12 live horses in the gallery space? Well, we've got this connection with Arte Povera, right? It's like the horse is not necessarily associated when it's alive with precious materials. And I'm sure you've all been around horses. Some of us might agree that they're prettier in pictures, right? When you're around them, they do all sorts of things that might come off a little NPC. They are very horsey, right? There'll be urination, defecation, snot, you name it. And the space itself is reeking of all these horse bodily fluids. For the duration of 3 days, the horses were taken away to the stables at night and then taken back to the gallery space in the morning. Imagine the shock of entering the gallery space and seeing this. What would bring Kounellis to stage this incredible work? Well, the history of art itself. Look at how horses have been represented in art. I mean, this is Napoleon, very famous painting by Jacques-Louis David. Napoleon crossing the Alps. By the way, it was on donkeys all along on the Alps. But can you imagine the portrait of Napoleon on a donkey as a state portrait? Not good. So there comes the horse, a horse that clearly has been to the salon because it looks extremely clean and pampered and beautified. And this is the issue with horses in the history of art itself. They're always associated with power. The more you keep looking at these paintings throughout the history of art, the more you realize that there really isn't much space for horses as horses, but that horses really have become the animal, the quintessential kingly animal, because they're always associated with this equestrian portrait. So what does it mean to encounter animals the way that we encounter them in this work by Kounellis? It really means to encounter them in a way that doesn't comply with the tradition of classical art. It shows us the horse with all its horsiness, the smells, the unpredictability. You can get kicked by any of these. And in a sense, it's pushing forward an important critique of representation itself. And we're going to return to this with other works today. But the idea that a picture, painting a horse, taking a photograph of a horse, is just not enough. What is the point of art if it always shows you a picture of something that you can actually experience in the flesh? Right? So this is the big question that Kounellis is asking, but in the process is also changing the history of representation of animals in art. Because a few live animals that trickled in before in the gallery space, they always cause a bit of a sensation, right? Because it's unusual. But it's the framework, the fact that he is concerned with the history of the representation of the animal in art that really harnesses this encounter. You're not just encountering horses like you would in a stable, you're encountering what will actually become postmodern horses, right? These are the unruly horses of postmodern art. And Jannis Kounellis continues this rural connection as well. There is something interesting about these horses without a kingly rider. They become horses, and horses have much more than kingly traditions attached to them. But of course, classical art has always been concerned mostly with royal portraits and horses, the purity of the lineage of horses. But Kounellis is concerned with his relationship with nature and his relationship with Greece and Italy, with the rural and the urban, with this kind of essential energy that he finds in the history of the past and the condition of the present. So this work is really interesting. Most of his works, you probably noticed already, are untitled, which is really fascinating, because when you untitle, right, a work of art, you basically you're giving the viewer license to interpret in an even more open way than if you gave somebody a title. In most cases, a title works as a handle, right? It's like what allows you to understand what it's not obvious at first glance. But in this case, you can really see how Kounellis plays with this notion. So you encounter these objects in the gallery space, you encounter the horses, and then you're like asked as the viewer to solve the conundrum. It's like, what is this? And in this case, we actually have an interesting gathering of different pulses and beans, like chickpeas, coffee beans, green lentils, green peas, kidney beans. It's a different combination every time you stage this work. And apparently in 1969, when it was first exhibited, viewers were allowed to choose whatever they like and consume in the gallery space. I don't know if you've ever had the pleasure to choose some mildly roasted chickpea or beans. Not exciting, but it can be done. And especially coffee beans can actually be fun. And the idea here that Kounellis was going with, was pursuing, is this notion of preciousness. Again, the idea of the experience in a gallery space in which you can consume the work of art. Now, some of you are probably thinking of González Torres and the candies, and how this idea of participation in the making or in the process as part of the work seems to be very now, but Arte Povera was already thinking with these ideas. And to Kounellis especially, symbolism plays a role. His symbolism is always idiosyncratic and partly universal, so it can be shared with different cultures. Of this work specifically, he said that the sacks are a memory of maritime commerce. They are universal in a sense. The whole world uses them to ship food in different ways. And they also, to him, represent motherhood, which is how he creates his poetics. Jannis Kounellis is extremely poetic as an artist. The rawness and the simplicity of the works we see here is usually counterbalanced by this surprise that if you read an interview or read a conversation the artist was engaged in, is revealed. And it's really fascinating. The idea of motherhood here is associated with the fact that the sack holds something and contains something, and it's designed to nourish and nurture. And this is an interesting statement by Kounellis himself. It says, Arte Povera aims to liberate viewers from the ideological constructs and behavioral incrustations that condition the experience of art and through it of life. So you can see how there is a determination here of dismantling the ideological constructs and behavioral incrustations. This idea of incrustations is really funny too. It's this idea of something that sediments and stick to a surface to a point that it cannot be removed from it without lifting parts of it or tampering with it or ruining it. So another really fascinating work by Jannis Kounellis is right here, and it's another untitled work, surprise, but this one here comes with a subtitle, Campi, which means fields, and which applies to the front piece that we see here. What you see at the back, which is actually a parrot, a live parrot, not a taxidermy one, is called Pappagallo parrot. And at the back, the container you see with that white stuff bubbling out is called cotoniera, which is basically a container for cotton wool. And in this case, you see how Kounellis, by 1969, has already developed a very personal language. There's an aesthetic language based on minimalism. As you can see here, the materials of minimalism representing industry. The difference here is that the materials of minimalism are not trying to make us forget about the real world. They're trying to remind us of the real world. They never want to pose as this abstract, universal notion. They actually contain, as you can see here once again, the land specifically. This is about, again, the south of Italy and Greece, and the rationalization of the land, the modular agricultural dimension of nature. Nature that it's defined by us, nature that serves us. And I'm going to return to the parrot piece that we see in the background because it's particularly interesting. But I also just wanted to highlight the fact that today is relatively common to encounter live plants in the gallery space. But then again, 1969, here comes Kounellis. Done, right? The cacti had come in at that point already. Of course, he wasn't the first one to do it either, but really Arte Povera relishes this notion of living animals, living plants, natural materials that connect us with the outside world. This is probably one of the biggest challenges that I'm sure you can appreciate just by thinking of any exhibition you have seen, or about to say recently, any exhibition you have seen, ... The White Cube, the museum, has a phobia of the outside world, right? Everything is climate controlled, everything has to be free of insects or any pest, any threat, humidity that comes from the outside world is bad. And for obvious reasons, right? You want the artworks to be preserved, to last forever. But at the same time, that contingency, the idea that the museum, the gallery space, needs to isolate itself from the outside world, also becomes a metaphorical contingency. The idea that the gallery space, the museum, ultimately separates itself from the outside world by presenting reproductions of the outside world. A picture of a horse, a picture of a plant, not the horse, not the plant. So this is one of the biggest political statements by Arte Povera, to bring into the gallery space messy materials, materials that are associated with contamination, materials that are associated with this idea of dirt. Think about bringing coal, right, into the gallery space. This is a material that comes back to Kounellis a number of times in his work, and it's connected to a number of things. To him is literary base. He mentioned in an interview that he associates it with Victor Hugo, but he also associates it with his own childhood, the rural reality in which coal is associated with sustenance, with poor social classes, with labor, and at the same time, the processes that turn coal into energy. Jannis Kounellis is interested in fire, he's interested in heat, and these are to him primordial forces. So you see how he brings coal in the gallery space as a symbol of the Industrial Revolution, as a symbol of the underclass, as a symbol of struggle, but he's also instantly connecting it to a sense of possibility. The energetic potential of coal is important to the artist. And we find as well this kind of black and white approach, the muted palette, the coal, becoming central to some of his works that are mixed media, like in this case. I don't know if this is still on the wall at Tate, but it was at Tate Modern for a long while as I worked there. And it's another enigmatic work of art by Kounellis that has its roots planted in the surrealist tradition of painting. This is almost like De Chirico's Pittura Metafisica. It's like those empty landscapes that make the city look somewhat sinister. And as I speak, I just think what we're living through, and I feel like I should move on. You can see how there's nobody around, and on the right-hand side, there's this strange pseudo-architectural structure. It's not quite clear if that is a building or a view into some sort of tower, or if it's a set of images created through scratching by the artist on charcoal. So images of the industrial, urbanized reality made with the material that characterizes that reality. And then the birds, you see the two crows that are taxidermy in this case, which have been killed. Now this is quite interesting. And again, Kounellis is one of those artists who believes that the least you talk about your works, the better, others will find opportunities to read meaning into the work. So he's not really gone at length at explaining certain aesthetic solutions and decisions, but he mentioned how the birds might actually have a symbolic value in this case, which is related to letting dreams go, or having dreams taken away from us. On that cheerful note, here I am back to the part of Campi that was called Pappagallo, as I mentioned earlier. Remember the beautiful parrot at the back of the installation. At the very beginning, this was Jannis Kounellis' own pet, and he spent the whole time in the gallery space. It then became a trained parrot who dealt a lot better with the presence of people in the gallery space. And it turned into a really fascinating proposal that challenged representation itself. Why paint a parrot when you can have a real one, a live one in the gallery space? Of course, it created a lot of controversy. Many people object to the presence of live animals in the space itself, but you can see how Kounellis placed the parrot on that perch, and the backdrop represents painting, right? It's painting, or let's say the canvas, the space of the canvas from which the animal now emerges, because that representational space no longer is able to do justice to the complexity of what an animal really is. And this idea is then picked up by Michelangelo Pistoletto, another artist of the Arte Povera movement, the one who used mirrors. And he creates here a response, if you like, to Kounellis' work. This is actually a screen print on polished stainless steel. So it's reflective to a certain degree, but Pistoletto is actually returning the animal to a representational state, because to him what's important is the fact that we, the viewers, will be reflected in the mirror and will sort of create this strange representational, inhabit a strange representational dimension in which somehow the animals is always in front of us, right? Always reflected behind. And this ideology that drives the work of Pistoletto is very well explored in this incredible series about plants, which is so unknown, it hurts me. So Pistoletto dedicated the series from the parrot example to plants, because plants have really always occupied a marginal space in art. They're always reduced to symbols because plants don't speak. Plants don't seem to have behaviors that characterize their identities. So they always fill in the scene. It's got this beautiful, of course, very famous Sandro Botticelli's Primavera, where the plants are everywhere, all around, behind the protagonists. And in this case, as you can see, not only Pistoletto puts the plant on the foreground, and the plant is the only subject of this work, but again, using the mirrors, using the polished stainless steel as a mirror that reflects, the plant is always on the foreground. We always reflect ourselves behind the plant. So it really switches the roles, right? The plant becomes the protagonist of the painting, and we happen to be the other that comes in and relates to the plant. And there's something really fascinating about the relationship between Pistoletto and plants, because it continues outside the gallery space. This is actually a really good example, like I said earlier, that land art wasn't what Arte Povera was interested in. But in this case, you can see an outdoor statement, which nonetheless doesn't entail modifying the environment through building a wall or building a jetty or stretching a massive amount of fabric across hillsides, but it's actually based on planting trees, right? Pistoletto created this notion of the third paradise, which is this symbol that you see here that he uses in different works he created later on in his career. So what are the paradises that Pistoletto alludes to with this symbol that we see here? The first paradise is, if you like, the primordial one, the primordial of human and nature. The second is the artificial paradise developed by human intelligence, globalization, and science. And the third paradise is what he envisions as this possibility of harmony between the two. So the third paradise is the connection between the artifice, the science, the fictionality of our conceptions of nature, and nature itself, the whole non-human dimension with us in it. And it's a beautiful message, I think, to send. It's a beautiful proposition that I think I could have put some faith in just a few years ago. Now, ask me next year how I feel about it. But I just wanted to foreground how different this statement is about nature and the environment and how it manifests itself in opposition to land art of a kind of classical style of the 1960s. And now Giuseppe Penone, he probably is the star of Ecologies, Nature, and Arte Povera. You remember this piece when he was basically giving us a glint of a subjective view reflected into his own eyes. If you look into his eyes as he wears these mirrored contact lenses, you actually see what he sees, right? It's this kind of subjective opportunity to share subjectivity, if you like. So Giuseppe Penone is an incredibly interesting artist when it comes to nature, and possibly the most committed to the notion of reinventing nature, but also to make us close, to bring us close to nature. Look at this sense of humor once again. The work is based on two stones, one of which is natural, the other one which is actually reconstructed, right? So one is a sculpture by the artist, the other one is the real stone, and they're presented to you on the gallery floor the way we see them here. This is questioning the whole of classical art, the whole of the idea of mimesis in art and what its real purpose is, especially when a stone becomes the subject. You know, stones always get the least possible interest in culture. In fact, if you collect stones, usually you get a bad name. But there's something really fascinating about them, very primordial, very essential. And this notion of something that can be timeless, being reproduced and just opposed. You know, there is something man-made and something natural that technically falls outside the remit of our interest, the remit of our purposefulness. This is not something that falls in any shape or form in the canon of classical artistic interest. And this is probably the most fascinating work. I remember becoming aware of this work again at Tate Modern years ago when I worked there and been absolutely blown away. Unfortunately, most visitors to the gallery or most people who encounter these works assume that Penone just went to the woods, stripped off some trees, glued them to some pedestals and walked away. But this is not what's going on at all. Penone is actually incredibly engaged with materials and process. And the process is very important to the meaning of the work. So, ripetere il bosco, to repeat the forest here again, this concept of mimesis. What is the point of copying something that exists in nature and that is probably already better, right? Well, one of the points he's trying to make with this has to do with urbanization, industrialization, capitalism, and nature. The dichotomy of nature and culture, right? The flickering of one and the other. So think about this. Giuseppe Penone got himself the industrially shaped beam that you still see at the bottom here, at the base of each tree. And he then proceeded to carve out the tree from the beam. So you can see how a beam is actually a tree that's being turned into an architectural element, right? So nature, tree in a symbolic term, turned into culture, the architectural module, and then the artist is trying to recover from this architectural model that's being created by industrial machinery, the essence of the tree. So it's like a younger tree, right? Because you know how trees grow from the inside out. I think it's incredibly poetic, very difficult to pull off technically. These trees they fool the eye, they really look like trees in their own right. And yet they are entirely sculpted. You know, the questions here that come together. Is it possible to perhaps reverse industrialization? Is it possible to return what we deem natural to a natural state after we've tampered with it? The trees are not alive after all. So this idea that nothing is natural and everything becomes cultural really defines his work and his approach to materials. What he said about his process is that he doesn't want to change the material, he wants to follow its lead. And that's exactly what becomes visible if you get closer to these beautiful trees. And you can see that that tree is not glued on, it's actually carved out. And you can see that there are no separations between what now looks like a pedestal and what used to be the inner part of the tree itself. And then there's other beautiful conception. You can see how this idea of time, how trees develop, how trees grow, and the possibility of recovering something that's gone of that natural essence really haunts Penone's work. Here too, it's easy to assume that he just carved a space inside the tree to make it hollow, and then placed in the middle a small tree, found some place. This is all sculpted from that one original tree. And I can actually show you Penone at work on this other incredible piece. This is an incredibly large, as you can see, section of a cedar. And that's how he works it. You can see this intimacy. Remember when I told you that Arte Povera values the intimacy, the connection with materials, and rediscovering nature. What will you learn about a tree by carving it on this scale, with this commitment, with this focus that you cannot learn by looking at a picture of a tree or just by stopping at the scientific conception of a tree? That's where the process of being an artist, the discovery, the journey becomes important. And Giuseppe Penone also made, as you can see, this is a work from 2008, so much more recent. As I said, his career has been extraordinary and well extends Arte Povera, but he still works with Arte Povera core ideas. In this case, this is like another amazing piece I had the opportunity to see at Whitechapel Gallery in London. He's actually made a cast of the outside of a tree. So what you see is actually the image, the imprint of the bark of the tree on the inside of it, right? And that's being coated in gold by the artist. He then allowed the outside of the tree to retain the material essence of the plaster that he used in order to create the cast. So he created this kind of double-sided cast. And on the outside, if you had the opportunity to look at it much closer than I can allow you, unfortunately, with the photographs that are available, you would actually see fingerprints. The fingerprints of the artist who applied the plaster outside the tree. So you can see here how this is no longer just a portrait of a tree. This is not just the representation of something, but it's the trace, not just of the tree, but of the process which generated this rendition of the tree and the artist sort of becoming a third object, right? This is the essential third object that it's being produced by the body of the tree and the body of the artist coming together with this tactile process that is evidenced by the fingerprints that we see on the outside. And again, this tactile quality you can see here this beautiful work in which Penone has inserted a cast of his own forearm and hand in a tree. And as you know, trees tend to grow around materials that constrict them. So it's really fascinating to see how in this point, the tree will not continue to grow. The title translates into it will continue to grow except at that point. So what the artist is trying to do is to relate to the tree, to relate to the passing of time, and at the same time to create something that, again, evokes this notion of the human and the natural coexisting. And in this case, of course, it's a constricting action. It's not a positive action for the tree itself. But there's other works in which Giuseppe Penone actually really explores this notion of the bodily presence in the natural environment. You can see him here at work on this piece with a long title that translates into my height, the length of my arms, and my width in a stream. So again, as I mentioned earlier, the notion of the body being the measure of an intimacy with nature. And here it is in action. You can see how it basically becomes a frame, right, for an ever-developing painting that exists in the woods and that can be encountered. It constantly changes and it involves the natural elements as they change without constricting them too much, but just negotiating this idea of the frame, which is so essential to Western art in general. And again, the idea of nature and culture as we've inherited that idea. Mario Merz, another artist we've encountered earlier, again, a leader of Arte Povera, who worked with poor materials, like in this case, wood and beeswax. This is a really interesting conception of autobiography. You know, Mario Merz was born in Turin. His father lived in the city too, and he worked at the Fiat factory. You remember the car manufacturer. And the title Ingot is actually referencing that very building, the Fiat building, which the artist represents here as a box made of beeswax. This is because beeswax is associated with wealth in the tradition of Western culture and classical art. And of course, the wealth, the financial wealth of the city came from the Fiat building. That's where so many people in the city worked. He then juxtaposes to this idea of wealth and elevation. Don't forget Turin is up on the Alps. With the surrounding unforgiving nature. So these shrubs, the poverty, the harsh reality of the countryside with the wealth, the promise of wealth of the urbanization of the city. Or this work in which Mario Merz gets involved with mathematics. Now, this is an ongoing interest of Mario Merz, the Fibonacci numbers. I'm sure you're all familiar with the Fibonacci number. They are the criterion that's written in nature, the mathematical criterion of nature, if you like, the proportionality that defines everything about the growing of a branch on a tree, the wing of a butterfly. It's in the Fibonacci number. It's kind of like the secret mathematical code of nature. And you can see how it tries to associate it. The question again here is, what is nature then, if we can break down its essential code into a mathematical code, right? So taxidermy makes total sense here, because taxidermy is not nature, it's not animals, it's a cultural manifestation of what used to be an animal. And he really plays with this idea of the juxtaposition between taxidermy animals, which by the way have been all the rage for the past 15 years, and the Fibonacci number in neon, again, is something we should pay attention to. Mario Merz worked extensively in neon. You can also see one of his most important installations on the Mole Antonelliana in Torino, which is actually another strip of Fibonacci numbers that's lit up at night. Again, this idea of reaching out to people with these concepts that make people wonder and question the essence of what it is that we're exploring, and leading us back to a nature that never is what we thought it was. Alighiero Boetti is another artist who you will remember we explored in previous lectures, and he created this zoo with little toy animals. He worked on it with his children, and on the zoo, about the zoo, he said, these animals carry within them the memory of millions and millions of predecessors. They remind us of deep time, a primordial time, slow, anonymous, identical, immobile, and unchanged. So you see how he's trying to think about this idea of nature, and the idea of nature as something that somehow is exceeding the notion of humanity, something that we should feel ourselves connected to in a different way. Yet these animals are all organized by species. They're grouped together, and the title zoo gives it away that it very much has in mind the limitations of our relationship with nature and with animals itself, our conception of animals as plastic toys, right? And of course, both are, I think, culture and nature intertwine in different ways in his work. So his very famous paintings of planes caught flying in different directions in a very playful way really remind us of this limits of culture and nature, where, for instance, you can easily see the connection between our observation of the flight of birds and insects and planes. But the fact that these planes don't fly on linear paths really brings in this unruly quality, that it's so natural, and that suddenly creates a scene that it's simultaneously hilarious and exhilarating at times, but at the same time very concerning. It's obviously the outcome of a plane flight of this kind would just be collisions in the sky. When it comes to humor, Pino Pascali is another fantastic artist of the Arte Povera movement. And I say fantastic quite on cue, because there's something he really captured. That's Pino Pascali himself, as you can see in the picture. And that's one of his most famous works, called La Vedova Blu, which translates into the Blue Widow. As you can see, the number of legs is wrong, and the size is not very accurate, so is the shape of the body. This is all deliberate. This is what it looks like in a color photograph. What is Pino Pascali up to? Well, as I said, fantastical, because during the 1960s and 70s eventually, the scientific education, let me just step back. This is a tricky concept. I don't mean it to sound anti-science, but we need to remember that there was a time, a long time ago, and that different cultures relate to this development in Western culture in different ways, where science wasn't the predominant lens through which we were allowed to look at nature. So mythology, for instance, constructed a vision of nature that was very different from a scientific vision of nature. Animals could inhabit dimensions of fluidity with humans. Think about Native Americans and the coyote, for instance. Animals transform themselves into other beings. Science has done a great deal of good in letting us know how these animals actually function, how they exist, how they reproduce, their behavior. But at the same time, in the process, it has stripped animals of all the magic. And only fables have been allowed to represent animals in a magical way. And they become the matter for children, right? Fables. So what Pino Pascali is trying to do is recover that magic, that enthusiasm, even the scary idea of what an animal can be, the magic of nature, and then creates these animals, as you can see here. This is actually also a pan, the Baco da Setola. In Italian doesn't mean anything, but Baco da Seta is a silkworm. Setola is the bristles, right? So it's created this new species called bristleworm. And it's, again, created within the Arte Povera conception of making something out of nothing. There's a playfulness here of inventing nature, in a sense, finding the magic in nature and creating one's own mythology. And because that's important too, right? It can't all be about climate change. We have to really be enthusiastic about nature as a place in which our creativity can also find place. It doesn't always have to be about the scientific dimension. But I thought it would be interesting to juxtapose Pino Pascali's approach to Piero Gilardi, who actually was and still is an activist and environmentalist, who created these sort of painterly / sculptural bas relief sculptural notions of made of polyurethane that represents different environments, different moments from the seasons, and different moments of the agricultural life. As you can see, they are called nature carpets, and you can actually see here Gilardi lying on one of them. There is something really fascinating about these nature carpets because carpets are something we walk on, usually without much consideration. So to create these carpets, which he actually started to make on very long rolls that could unfold so that you could get yourself 7 meters of this specific carpet, really talk about the commoditization of nature. Nature not as this thing that exists out there, but something that it's always defined by our power, economic powers, our needs, nature that is resource, nature that is always something for us to consume. And when it comes to consuming, this work by Giovanni Anselmo probably wins the high recognition and honors. How would you consider a structure that eats? So these are 2 blocks of granite, and we see this salad that's basically compressed between the 2 blocks, kept together by a metal wire. And of course, what happens in time, doesn't take long, is that the salad begins to wilt. And if it's not replenished constantly, the structure itself collapses. You can see another moment in this installation here. So I have to say, Giovanni Anselmo was pretty fond of this processes of things that dropped, things that moved, things that changed. But this work has been interpreted in many ways. Of course, the sculpture is not necessarily eating anything, but it's an interesting consideration of this kind of like transient quality, the idea of a work of art that has a sculptural or even architectural present, that it's made precarious by something that it's natural, right? So it can be read as the kind of revenge of nature, or this idea of the inanimate objects never being fully inanimate, but being charged with agency with through art. And the last artist, or the last artwork I'd like to focus and wrap up our lecture with is another work by Alighiero Boetti, we have seen today, but I thought it would make sense to wrap up with an image of the world as seen from above. There's something fascinating about Alighiero Boetti and his fascination with Afghanistan, where he spent a lot of time working and collaborating with weavers who created a series of maps following his instructions. And I have 2 here that you can see. Of course, this is a project that he developed over time. And what happens over time is that the geographical, let's say over a short period of time, the geographical appearance of the world hasn't changed much, but the political appearance of the world has changed. So it really introduces an important notion of fixity and how our desire, or let's say our relationship with nature is defined constantly by this desire to fix things, not to let them change. Think about you and your garden and how hard you work sometimes to get your garden to look in a certain way, and then you gotta give up. It's like you can't really control it beyond a certain point. And so much of our relationship with nature is based on controlling. And when you think about politics and you think about territories, borders, geography, boundaries, then you get a sense that we're obsessed with controlling everything, what goes in, what goes out. Nature always tries to disrespect our desire to control, to delimit, to isolate. And I think there is something very important, very essential about this junction between the ways of nature to go with the flow, to continue to just have no plan, and our desire to constrain, our desire to retain and prevent things to flow as they should. So, on that notion, I hope you enjoyed. This is the time where usually you come and talk to me at the end. We have a chat, so we can continue perhaps this conversation through that. Might not be quite the same, but we'll make it work. And if you want to get in touch with me, by all means, send me an email or follow me on Instagram. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Giovanni. I appreciate it very much.